The wire began to move. At 3:42 in the morning on June 22, 1944, east of Vitebsk, a Soviet sapper was lying flat in the wet grass with a pair of wire cutters pressed against his chest. His name may not have survived in the report. Men like him often vanished into a sentence. Engineer groups cleared passages. Obstacles were removed. Assault elements advanced. Clean words. Dry words. The kind of language headquarters used after the mud had already swallowed the details. But in that field before dawn nothing was clean. The grass was cold enough to soak through the elbows. Somewhere behind him, Soviet guns waited in darkness, their barrels already laid on German trenches that could not yet be seen. Farther back, riflemen crouched in shallow assembly areas, smoking in silence or not smoking at all, because a glowing cigarette could be enough to bring down mortar fire. Tank engines sat quiet. Horses shifted. A radio hissed under a blanket. Ahead of him was the German line. Not a line in the way it appeared on a map. Not a neat pencil stroke crossing Belarusian forest and marsh. Up close it was wire, mines, trip flares, listening posts, machine gun slits, shell holes filled with black water, timber bunkers sunk into earth, and men who were also tired, also afraid, also waiting for the sky to break open. The sapper moved one hand forward, then the other. His job was not to fight the battle. Not yet. His job was to make the battle possible. A wire strand brushed his sleeve. He froze. Somewhere beyond the German position, a flare rose. For a moment the ground turned white. Every blade of grass cast a shadow. The sapper's face pressed deeper into the dirt. He could smell soil, damp canvas, sweat, metal, and the faint chemical odor of explosives from the satchel beside him. If the Germans saw him, they would not need to hit him directly. One burst into the wire. One mortar round into the lane. One shout from a sentry. That would be enough. The men waiting behind him would still be waiting when daylight came, and daylight would belong to the machine guns. This was how a front began to change. Not with a general speech. Not with a tank rolling forward under a banner. Not with a perfect arrow drawn across a headquarters map. With a man in the grass, holding his breath, trying to cut wire without making it sing. On that same day, Operation Bagration began. It would become one of the most devastating defeats ever inflicted on the German army, tearing through Army Group Center across Belarusia in the summer of 1944. But before the maps changed, before German headquarters understood the scale of the disaster, before the roads to Minsk filled with retreating columns, small engineer groups had to open small gaps in very real obstacles. Operation Bagration ran from June 22 to August 19, 1944, and destroyed much of German Army Group Center. German commanders believed they understood the front. They believed in strongpoints, fields of fire, registered artillery, anti-tank guns, infantry positions, reserves held back for counterattack. They believed that if a Soviet assault came, it would come in weight, in noise, in numbers. They had seen it before. Soviet artillery would roar. Infantry would advance. Tanks would try to break through. German guns would cut them down or slow them long enough for the defense to recover. There was reason to believe this. The Eastern Front had taught every army cruel lessons. Punished imagination and punished arrogance. German officers had watched Soviet attacks collapse in mud, snow, confusion, and fire. They had also seen Soviet soldiers come on again after losses that would have broken other armies. They feared Soviet mass. But mass in their minds still had shape, still had rules, still needed roads, lanes, bridges, crossings, coordination. What many of them did not fully see was that the Red Army had learned the same lesson from the other side. If tanks needed roads, sappers would make roads. If infantry needed gaps, sappers would cut gaps. If rivers stopped armies, sappers would bridge rivers. If German armor depended on speed, sappers would bury speed under mines. The German command map showed a defensive line. In the mud, Soviet sappers were already turning that line into something else. The wire cutter closed slowly. There was a small metallic bite. Then the wire gave. Behind him, hundreds of men were still waiting for the signal. But the first opening had been made. And the Germans, listening from their trenches, did not yet understand that the first sound of the offensive might not be artillery. It might be wire being cut in the dark. What the Germans thought the front was. In a German headquarters dugout, the front looked manageable in a way it never did outside. There were lamps, pencils, telephones, situation maps pinned to boards, thin arrows, red marks for Soviet concentrations, blue or black lines for German units depending on the map and the staff officer who had drawn it. Roads were clear on paper. Rivers had names. Villages were symbols. Woods were patches of color. Minefields were shaded areas. Defensive belts looked like systems built by reason. Out there, beyond the dugout, men were ankle-deep in water, hungry, short of sleep, and sometimes too exhausted to recognize the sound of an approaching shell until it landed. But command requires abstraction. Every army does it. No officer can carry the full smell of the front into every decision. So the German commanders studied their maps and tried to impose order on a war that kept refusing it. They believed the front was held by weapons and men. Machine guns, artillery, mortars, anti-tank guns, dug-in infantry, observation posts, reserves, strong points built around villages and road junctions, kill zones, interlocking fire. This belief had not come from stupidity, came from experience. In 1941, German formations had driven deep into Soviet territory with frightening speed. They had seen Soviet units shattered, surrounded, overrun, abandoned. In 1942, they had still believed they could decide the war through movement, encirclement, and operational skill. Then came Stalingrad, then Kursk, then the long retreat that followed. By 1944, the confidence was thinner, but the habits remained. German commanders still trusted the local skill of their units. A German infantry position properly laid out could be very hard to break. German anti-tank gunners knew their craft. German artillery observers could turn an open field into a killing ground. Even under terrible pressure, German units often improvised with discipline and speed. So when they looked at a Soviet assault, they expected certain things. They expected numbers. They expected artillery preparation. They expected infantry waves. They expected tanks pushing through whatever gap they could find. They expected the Soviets to pay heavily for every meter. They did not expect the ground itself to become part of the Soviet plan in such a systematic way. That was the blind spot. A minefield to a commander could look like a delay. A river could look like a natural obstacle. A forest could look like a barrier to vehicles. A ruined village could look like a defensive anchor. A swamp could look like protection for a flank. To the Soviet sapper, each of those things was not fixed. A minefield could be added to in the night, or quietly opened. A river could be crossed with boats, rafts, assault bridges, pontoon sections, and men half-frozen in the current. A forest could hide an approach route. A village wall could be blown open. A swamp track could be reinforced just enough for guns to pass. The front was not just defended, could be engineered. Before Bagration, German intelligence expected a major Soviet effort, but often looked in the wrong places or underestimated how deep the preparation had gone. Soviet deception measures helped conceal the full scale and direction of the coming offensive. In the days and hours before the assault, Soviet combat engineers used noise, darkness, and bombardment to mask the clearing of passages through German obstacles. A German commander might receive a report. Enemy activity heard near the wire. He had heard such reports before. Patrols, scouts, nervous sentries, local probing, Soviet infantry feeling for weak points. But this time, the activity near the wire did not stand alone. It was connected to artillery registration behind the lines, to reconnaissance patrols, to bridge materials hidden under trees, to mine-clearing teams, to assault groups forming in darkness, to tank units waiting for one cleared lane to become a road. What they believed was that the Soviet attack would reveal itself when the barrage began. What really happened was that the attack had already begun before the first shell. It began with measuring, listening, cutting, marking, learning the ground. A front is not only where soldiers stand. It is where movement is possible and where movement is denied. By 1944, Soviet sappers were learning to control that invisible boundary. The Germans saw trenches. The sappers saw doors. And somewhere in the dark, another wire strand was bending under the pressure of steel cutters. The hidden problem. A front can be engineered. The hidden problem was not that German commanders ignored engineers. No serious army could afford that. German engineers had blown bridges, laid mines, cleared obstacles, built defenses, opened roads, and repaired crossings since the first days of the war. They were skilled. They were brave. Many died doing the same kind of close, dirty work Soviet sappers did. No one who had watched an engineer crawl toward a minefield under machine gun fire would call his work secondary. The problem was deeper. German command often treated engineering as support for the battle. The Soviets were increasingly making it part of the battle's design. That difference mattered. A support function waits for orders. A design function shapes what orders are possible. In the Soviet system that emerged from the catastrophic early years of the war, engineering was not only about fixing what terrain had broken. It was about preparing the battlefield so that the next blow landed harder. Sappers built field fortifications, laid mines, removed mines, cut wire, opened roads, prepared river crossings, disguised troop concentrations, and supported assault groups against fortified positions. They were the hands of operational patience. A tank crew could see the world through armor glass and gun smoke. A sapper saw the world in inches, the angle of a wire, the softness of a roadbed, the color of disturbed earth, the shadow under a bridge, the sound a boot made on frozen planks, the gap between two German fields of fire. These were not romantic observations. They were survival. At Kursk, this way of thinking became brutal and visible. The Soviet defense was not a single line but a deep system of trenches, belts, mines, anti-tank positions, fallback areas, and routes for counterattack. Red Army combat engineers laid hundreds of thousands of mines in the Kursk salient. Estimates cited in historical summaries include more than 500,000 anti-tank mines and more than 400,000 anti-personnel mines, with the densest belts placed where German armored attacks were expected. The German attacker did not just meet Soviet soldiers. He met preparation. A tank that hit a mine became more than a lost vehicle. It became a roadblock. The tank behind it slowed. The tank behind that one stopped. Infantry bunched up. Engineers had to come forward. Artillery observers looked for the cluster. Soviet guns began to work. A few minutes became 20. 20 became an hour. An hour became a missed opportunity. And in mobile war, lost time is not neutral. Lost time kills. What mattered was not only the number of mines. It was what the mines did to German decision-making. Mines forced caution into a system that depended on speed. They made commanders hesitate. They broke formation. They turned confident movement into negotiation with the ground. Then, when the Red Army shifted to large offensives, sappers reversed the logic. They were no longer only building traps. They were building release. Where the Germans expected swamp or river to protect a flank, engineers searched for a crossing. Where German wire was supposed to delay infantry, sappers opened lanes. Where rubble blocked a street, assault engineers blew passages through walls. Where a German bunker pinned down riflemen, a sapper group crawled close with explosives. The hidden problem for the Germans was that the Soviet front no longer behaved like an object. It behaved like a machine. Sometimes that machine absorbed German attacks. Sometimes it opened suddenly and released Soviet armies through a gap. The same men who planted mines in one operation might clear them in another. The same hands that built obstacles could dismantle obstacles. The same training that taught patience under defensive fire taught precision under offensive fire. This was not glamorous work. No camera loved it. There were no sweeping cavalry charges. No clean duels between famous weapons. No single dramatic moment that explained everything. There was a man kneeling in a ditch with a mine probe. There was a team dragging planks under shellfire. There was a corporal marking a lane with strips of cloth while bullets snapped through the dark. There was a bridge that had to hold not forever, but long enough. German commanders believed the front was the place where armies collided. What really happened was that Soviet sappers had learned to make the place of collision move. And that meant the next question was not where the Soviet attack would come. It was whether the Germans could recognize the attack before the ground under them had already been changed. The men before the men. Before the infantry rose from their trenches, the sappers had already been forward. Before tank engines coughed awake, someone had walked the route in darkness. Before artillery maps were corrected, someone had crawled close enough to hear German voices through the wire. They were the men before the men. Not always young. Not always strong in the way propaganda liked to show strength. Some had been factory workers. Some farmers. Some mechanics. Some had learned explosives from military instructors, others from surviving long enough to understand what killed careless men. Their work was practical, intimate, and unforgiving. A rifleman could fire from cover. A gunner could work behind a shield. A tanker had armor, thin or thick depending on the vehicle, but armor still. A sapper often had his hands. Hands that shook when they were cold. Hands that lost feeling in winter. Hands that had to distinguish a harmless wire from a lethal one. Hands that sometimes had to take off gloves because cloth dulled the fingertips, and a fingertip might be the difference between finding a mine and becoming part of the crater. The equipment looked ordinary until one understood what it meant. Wire cutters, probes, shovels, axes, rope, satchel charges, mines, marking flags, explosive blocks, flamethrowers in assault units, bridging material, wooden planks, canvas boats, steel helmets dented by fragments, sometimes steel breastplates, the SN-42, worn by assault engineer sapper troops who had to close with fortified positions at distances where every fragment seemed personal. Soviet assault engineer sapper brigades were formed in 1943, designed to break through fortified lines and storm settlements. These units became known for close combat engineering, coordination with infantry and armor, and distinctive equipment such as the SN-42 steel breastplate. But equipment did not remove fear. A steel breastplate did not make a man immortal. It left arms, legs, shoulders, and face exposed. It was heavy enough to remind the wearer of its presence with every breath. In rubble, it could snag. In heat, it could feel like a punishment. Against certain fragments and small arms under certain conditions, it might save a life. Against artillery, against a mine, against the wrong burst at the wrong angle, it was only metal. Still, some men wore it because there are moments in war when a small increase in survival feels like mercy. Imagine an assault group forming near a village held by German infantry. The village has no romance left in it. The roofs are burned open. The church wall is broken. Smoke has darkened the snow or the mud, depending on the season. German machine guns cover the main road because main roads are where men make mistakes. The obvious approach is death. So the sappers look elsewhere. A garden wall, a drainage ditch, collapsed stable, a cellar entrance, a blind corner. They are not searching for heroism. They are searching for a way in. The infantry waits behind them. That waiting has its own terror. Men listen to distant fire, check magazines, tighten straps, and try not to think about the fact that the first man through a breach is often not the man who sees sunset. The sapper moves forward with an explosive charge. Not because he is fearless, because someone must. The German defender on the other side may be a veteran who has seen 3 years of retreat and still knows how to place a machine gun. He may be hungry. He may be afraid of being surrounded. He may not hate the man coming toward him personally. That does not matter. The war has put them into a geometry of survival. One man must hold. One man must breach. And the front changes where they meet. The Red Army did not win because sappers were magical. It won because enough men did terrifying work often enough that terrifying work became a method. German commanders saw Soviet attacks becoming more coordinated, more dangerous, more persistent. What many of them did not see clearly enough was the human layer beneath that coordination. The crawling men, the measuring men, the men who carried explosives instead of certainty. They were rarely the largest formation on the map, but they were often the first to touch the future battlefield. And when Soviet command began asking them to do more than support attacks, when it began asking them to lead the first wound into the German line, the old idea of engineer work no longer fit. The next breach would not be made by force alone. It would be made by force guided through a gap barely wider than fear. Send engineers first. There is a kind of military idea that sounds wrong until the battlefield leaves no better choice. Send engineers first. Not behind the infantry. Not after the tanks have found the obstacles. Not later, when the smoke clears and the dead are counted. First, close enough to the wire to hear it tremble. Close enough to a bunker to feel the concussion in the teeth. Close enough to a minefield to understand that one careless knee can end the work of a platoon. For armies trained to think in traditional categories, this was uncomfortable. Engineers built, infantry assaulted, artillery suppressed, armor exploited. Each arm had its place. But the Eastern Front kept breaking clean categories. A fortified village did not care what branch a man belonged to. A minefield did not wait for doctrine. A bunker covering a road could stop infantry, delay tanks, and ruin a timetable. It had to be solved. Not described. Solved. So Soviet assault groups increasingly mixed functions. Riflemen, machine gunners, flamethrower operators, sappers, sometimes tanks or self-propelled guns, all working around a specific tactical problem. A trench system, a bunker, a strong point, a street, crossing. It was dangerous because it demanded closeness. Artillery could shake a position, but not every German dugout collapsed. Tanks could fire into walls, but not every wall opened where infantry needed it. Infantry could attack, but without cleared lanes and breached obstacles, they could be fed into the same killing ground again and again. The sapper carried the unpleasant answer. Explosives placed close. Wire cut by hand. Mines lifted one by one. Charges pushed against timber, earth, brick, concrete. A hole made where the map showed none. There were objections, spoken or unspoken. Engineers were too valuable to waste. Training them took time. Their work required precision. If they were used as assault infantry, they would die in numbers the army could not easily replace. And there was truth in that fear. But there was another truth. If the first obstacle was not broken, everyone behind it could die anyway. The ridiculous idea survived because the battlefield kept proving the need for it. Not in a conference room. Not in a manual. In fields where tanks burned because lanes had not been cleared. In villages where infantry stalled because a bunker survived the barrage. In river crossings where the first boats were swept away and someone had to go back into the water. A Soviet sapper did not have to call the idea brilliant. He might have called it the only thing left. There is a moment before an assault when time becomes strange. Men know the minute has been chosen. They know guns will open, whistles may sound, orders will pass down the line. They know they are inside a machine larger than themselves. But the body remains stubbornly personal. The mouth dries. The stomach tightens. The fingers check the same strap again. A man hears his own breath and resents it for being loud. For a sapper carrying a charge, the fear had a shape and weight. A satchel against the hip. A coil of wire. A fuse. A mine probe. The knowledge that the first yards may be crossed under covering fire, but the last yards will belong to luck and nerve. Across the line, German soldiers waited with their own fear. They had been told to hold. They had seen Soviet barrages before. Some trusted their bunkers. Some trusted their machine guns. Some trusted nothing. Veterans knew that the first silence after shelling could be worse than the shelling itself, because it meant men were coming. What German commanders believed was that prepared defenses forced the attacker to pay. What really happened was that Soviet sappers were learning how to decide where that payment would be made, and how much time the defender would have to collect it. The first true test was never clean. A charge might fail. A lane might be marked badly. Smoke might drift the wrong way. A German machine gun might survive. A tank might turn too early and crush the markers. Infantry might lose sight of the breach in dust and panic. Engineers might be killed before the last mine was lifted. War rarely rewards the perfect plan. It rewards the plan that still functions after men begin to die. And now, under fire, the theory had to crawl forward. The first gap. The first explosion did not open the whole front. It opened a few meters. That was enough. In battle, men often speak later about breakthroughs as if they were sudden. A line broke. Position fell. A road opened. A bridge was taken. But at the point of contact, a breakthrough can begin as something almost painfully small. A gap in wire. A lane through mines. A bunker silenced. A ditch crossed. A plank laid over mud. A white strip tied to a stake in darkness. The sapper knows that no one behind him can see what he sees. The infantry waiting 30 meters back sees only flashes. Smoke. Earth kicked up by bullets. Shadows moving where men should not be. The platoon commander may have a map, but the map does not show the mine under the dead branch. The tank commander may have orders, but orders do not show the shell crater deep enough to break a track. So the sapper becomes the map. At Kursk, the defensive version of this work reached a scale German attackers could not ignore. Soviet engineers created deep belts of mines, trenches, anti-tank ditches, wire, and fallback positions. German armor did advance, but repeatedly found that the ground itself had been organized against speed. In one famous southern sector episode, elements of Grossdeutschland's advance encountered minefields. Panthers were immobilized, engineers were brought forward, and the delay exposed men and vehicles to Soviet fire. This is the cold arithmetic of obstacle warfare. A mine does not need to destroy an army. It needs to stop the first vehicle. A stopped vehicle blocks the second. The second blocks the third. The column compresses. Compressed vehicles draw artillery. Artillery causes confusion. Confusion slows engineers. Slower engineers mean longer exposure. Longer exposure means more losses. The mine that exploded under one track may have been planted by one man in the dark, but its effect travels backward through an entire formation. German commanders had understood mines before Kursk. Of course they had. But at Kursk, mines became part of a layered defensive tempo. They were tied to fire plans, anti-tank guns, trenches, strongpoints, fallback belts, mobile obstacle detachments, and reserves. The ground was not merely dangerous. It was coordinated. Then, in later Soviet offensives, the same principle turned outward. Sappers did not only deny movement, they restored it. When a Soviet assault began in 1944, the question was not simply whether German defenses could be smashed by artillery. Artillery could stun, kill, cut wire, collapse trenches, and break communication. But artillery could also miss. Smoke could obscure the wrong area. German survivors could crawl back to firing positions. Mines could remain untouched. Wire could sag but not open. A cratered road could be worse after shelling than before. Someone still had to go forward. The sapper team might move during the bombardment, using the noise to hide the smaller sounds of cutting and digging. They might clear only a narrow passage, just wide enough for the first wave. They might mark it with branches, strips of cloth, lamps, or men standing where no man wanted to stand. If the markers disappeared in smoke, the lane could vanish. Then the first infantry came, not like a parade, not like a painting. Men bending low, stumbling, shouting, falling, losing direction, finding it again. A wounded man blocking the path. Another stepping over him because stopping could kill more. Officers trying to keep groups moving. Machine gun fire finding the lane. Mortars dropping short. The cleared passage becoming both salvation and target. This was the terrible contradiction. The sapper created the safest path. The enemy tried to make that path the deadliest place on the field. And still the gap mattered. Because once the first men crossed, more could follow. Once more followed, the German forward position could be flanked. Once it was flanked, the trench line that looked solid from headquarters began to lose meaning. A line is strong when everyone faces the right direction. The sapper's job was to create the first place where the defender had to turn his head. The Germans believed obstacles would slow the Red Army long enough for firepower to decide. What really happened was that Soviet sappers learned to make tiny openings under impossible pressure, and tiny openings, if exploited quickly, could become operational wounds. But there was a larger reversal waiting. Because once the Germans had learned to fear Soviet minefields, they faced something worse. Soviet engineers using the same discipline not to stop movement, but to unleash it. The front stops behaving like a front. By the summer of 1944, the German army in the east was no longer the army that had crossed the Soviet border in 1941. It was still dangerous, still experienced, still capable of local skill and stubborn defense. German officers and soldiers did not suddenly forget war. Many had spent years surviving it. They knew how to dig in, how to cover a road, how to place anti-tank weapons, how to read a field through smoke. But the front had grown too large, too deep, too strained. Reserves were thin. Fuel was uncertain. Communications were vulnerable. The air situation had changed. Soviet artillery had grown heavier and better coordinated. Soviet commanders had learned, often through catastrophic losses, how to concentrate force and conceal intention. And under all of that, sappers were changing the texture of the battlefield. A German commander could still understand an attack directly in front of him. He could call artillery, move reserves, order counterattacks, ask for permission to withdraw and often not receive it. He could read local danger. But Bagration was not a local danger. It was a system of dangers arriving together. The Soviet offensive struck across multiple sectors. Deception helped blur the true weight of the attack. German positions that seemed defensible became isolated. Roads became traps. Rivers did not hold as long as expected. Forests and marshes did not protect every flank. Soviet mobile forces pushed through gaps and widened the collapse. At ground level, this meant German soldiers began receiving reports that did not fit together. Enemy infantry in front. Tanks on the flank. Communications cut. Bridge threatened. Minefields breached. New crossing established. Rear road under fire. A defensive line depends on sequence. First contact, then response. First breach, then reserve. First threat, then decision. Soviet sappers helped disrupt sequence. They allowed attacks to begin closer than expected, cross places thought difficult, and continue when terrain should have paused them. They did not do this alone. Artillery, infantry, armor, air support, logistics, deception, and command all mattered. But without men opening the ground, the larger machinery lost its teeth. This was the battlefield reality that broke the earlier belief. The Germans had believed that obstacles bought time. What really happened was that obstacles bought time only when the enemy could not master them faster than you could react. At Kursk, Soviet mines stole German time. At Bagration, Soviet sappers helped steal German certainty. There is a difference. Time is measurable. Certainty is felt. A commander may accept that a tank unit is delayed. But when every report is late, every flank uncertain, every road threatened, every bridge at risk, the mind begins to lose the shape of the battle. Maps become accusations. Telephone lines go dead. Staff officers mark arrows they no longer trust. Orders move toward units that have already moved, broken, or disappeared. The German commander looks at the map and sees a line, then a gap, then another. Then the line is no longer a line. The front has stopped behaving like a front. Somewhere, a bridge that should have been destroyed is still standing long enough for Soviet troops to cross. Somewhere else, a German minefield has lanes through it before dawn. Somewhere a strongpoint is being attacked from the side because a sapper group found a way through rubble. Somewhere a road through forest, dismissed as unsuitable, now carries men and guns. None of this looks decisive in isolation. Together, it is the shape of defeat. The Red Army had not abolished chaos. Its own attacks still suffered confusion, casualties, delays, mistakes, and friendly fire. Soviet soldiers still died in enormous numbers. Sappers still failed. Bridges still collapsed. Lanes still disappeared. Some attacks went wrong within minutes. But the system had improved. And the Germans, who once counted on Soviet clumsiness to save them after the first shock, increasingly met an enemy that could absorb loss and still keep the operation moving. The reversal was not that Soviet sappers were suddenly recognized as decisive by everyone. The reversal was that German commanders began to feel their effect before they fully named it. A defense can survive pressure. It has a harder time surviving pressure that arrives through places it believed were closed. And the real measure of that change was not heroism alone. It was mathematics. Minutes, meters, loads, lanes, mines, bridges. The numbers were never dry to the men inside them. They were the distance between movement and death. The mathematics of survival. A battlefield does not need large numbers to become terrifying. Sometimes one number is enough. One disabled tank. One broken bridge. One uncleared mine. 1 hour lost before daylight. One lane wide enough for infantry but too narrow for vehicles. One engineer platoon killed before marking the passage. Commanders count divisions. Soldiers count steps. For the sapper, mathematics lives close to the ground. How far to the wire? How many seconds does the fuse give? How much weight can the plank hold? How many men can cross before artillery adjusts? How many mines can be lifted before the barrage ends? There is no clean separation between arithmetic and fear. If a bridge must hold for 20 minutes, those 20 minutes are not abstract. They are boots on planks, wheels on timber, water pressing against supports, shells walking closer, a corporal shouting for the next truck to move faster because stopping is worse than risking collapse. If a lane through mines is 2 meters wide, a panic step outside it can kill. If smoke hides the markers, men drift. If men drift, the safe path becomes rumor. If the first tank in a column hits a mine, the column behind it does not simply wait. It becomes visible. It becomes dense. It becomes a target. This was why sappers mattered beyond their numbers. Their work multiplied or divided time. At Kursk, Soviet mine belts and obstacle systems did not have to stop every German vehicle permanently. They had to slow the advance, disrupt formation, expose armor to anti-tank guns and artillery, and make the German timetable bleed. The Soviet defenses at Kursk were built in depth, with major belts, trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and prepared fallback positions reaching far behind the first line. What matters is not only the number of mines. It is what the number reveals. The Soviet command had begun thinking of the battlefield as a depth problem. Not a single collision. Not one trench. Not one heroic stand. A sequence of friction. If the first belt did not stop the Germans, it would wound them. If it did not wound them enough, the second belt would slow them. If they broke through, reserves and additional positions waited. The sapper was part of that sequence. Then, in attack, the sequence reversed. A cleared lane might save minutes. A captured bridge might save hours. A repaired road might save a day. And on the Eastern Front, a day could be the difference between a German unit withdrawing in order and being surrounded. This is the quiet violence of engineering. A rifle kills a man. A sapper's work can decide whether 1,000 men arrive before or after the window closes. But numbers alone can mislead. A minefield shown on a map may look impressive. A bridge tonnage may sound technical. A lane width may feel like a manual detail. None of that carries the sound of men trying to cross under fire. Imagine a temporary crossing in the dark. No grand bridge. Nothing permanent. Just enough structure for men, guns, or light vehicles to get across. The river is black. The far bank flashes orange when shells land. Someone is shouting over engine noise. Someone else is waist-deep in water, holding a rope with hands so cold they no longer feel like hands. A truck starts across. The boards shift. Everyone hears it. For half a second, the whole crossing becomes silent in the minds of the men watching, even though the guns are still firing. If the truck falls through, the route blocks. If the route blocks, the guns behind wait. If the guns wait, the infantry beyond the river fights without them. Then the truck moves another meter. And another. The bridge holds. Not because it is beautiful. Not because it is safe. Because it is enough. That word appears again and again in sapper warfare. Enough. Enough gap. Enough time. Enough cover. Enough timber. Enough men alive to finish the work. German commanders believed combat power was measured mainly in formations and weapons. What really happened was that combat power often depended on whether those formations and weapons could physically reach the place where they mattered. A tank that cannot cross a river is not combat power. A gun without a road is weight. An infantry battalion trapped behind wire is manpower waiting to be spent. The sappers turned potential into contact. And that work carried a cost no table could fully show. Because the men doing the measuring, cutting, lifting, and bridging were usually the closest men to the blast. The men closest to the blast. There are deaths in war that are seen by many men. A tank burns on open ground. An aircraft falls trailing smoke. A bunker disappears under direct fire. These deaths become visible because the machine is visible. A sapper's death can be smaller from a distance. A flash in the grass. A body beside a wire fence. A man gone from a boat. A gap in the team where someone had been kneeling moments before. The work itself keeps moving because it has to. If a mine kills the first man, the second man may still have to clear the lane. If a shell hits the bridge crew, another crew may be ordered forward. If the charge fails to destroy the bunker, someone has to carry another one. War does not pause for grief at the point where grief is born. This is one of the cruelest things about sapper work. It demands human delicacy inside mechanical urgency. A man must use touch, judgment, patience. He must not rush a mine. He must not pull the wrong wire. He must not place the charge badly. But behind him are men waiting to move, officers watching the clock, artillery schedules already unfolding, tanks burning fuel, wounded men calling for evacuation, and a larger operation that may not care whether his hands are shaking. He may be 19. He may be 37. He may have a letter folded inside his tunic. He may have learned the task only months earlier because the army needed him to learn it. He may know very well that the first man into an obstacle belt is often not the man whose name appears in the final report. There are accounts of sappers taking off gloves in winter to feel for wires or mines. Whether every such story can be individually verified matters less than the reality behind it. The work required physical intimacy with hidden death. The mine did not announce itself. The wire did not explain its purpose. The ground lied unless a man learned how to question it. And then there was the moral weight of opening a path for others. A sapper marked a lane knowing men would trust it. That trust could save them, or fail them. If he missed a mine, someone behind him might die. If he marked the path badly, a squad could wander into death. If he moved too slowly, the attack might stall. If he moved too quickly, his own mistake could kill more men than caution would have cost. This was not the clean heroism of posters. It was responsibility under exhaustion. The German soldier facing him was not a symbol either. He was often another exhausted man inside another system. He may have been ordered to hold a position that no longer made sense. He may have known the Soviet barrage meant something larger was coming. He may have watched his own engineers die trying to repair a breach or clear a minefield. He may have fired at shadows because shadows were all the war gave him. The tragedy is that both men were often doing exactly what their armies demanded. One held the line. One opened it. And between them was the ground. When Soviet assaults succeeded, the cost could disappear into the language of success. The obstacle was overcome. The bridgehead was established. The enemy strongpoint was reduced. But a reduced strongpoint is not a reduced thing to the men who reduced it. It is smoke in the throat, deafness after the blast, brick dust in the eyes, a friend who does not answer, a German soldier dazed in a trench, a wounded man asking for water in a language the other side does not understand. The sappers changed the front, but the front changed them too. Some survived by skill, some by luck, some because the mine under their hand was old, damp, badly placed, or never armed. Some died because everything had been done correctly and the shell landed anyway. What German commanders eventually recognized in reports as Soviet engineering skill was, at ground level, a chain of individual risks taken by men who could not see the whole chain. They knew only the next obstacle, the next wire, the next charge, the next crossing. And when the reports were written afterward, the question remained. Would anyone understand what had actually happened before the tanks appeared on the far side? Recognition written too late. After a battle, armies try to make sense of what happened by turning chaos into language. They write reports. They count losses. They mark maps. They describe enemy tactics. They explain success if they won, failure if they lost, and confusion if the truth is too large for either. In those reports, the sapper often becomes a function. Engineer support, obstacle clearance, mine laying, bridge construction, assault group activity, useful phrases, necessary phrases, phrases that remove mud from the boots and blood from the hands. German reports, when they began to recognize the pattern, often did so through consequences. Soviet minefields were deeper than expected. Soviet crossings appeared quickly. Soviet attacks emerged through difficult terrain. Fortified positions were breached with close coordination. Roads thought unusable became routes of advance. Strongpoints were bypassed, isolated, or attacked from unexpected angles. The recognition was real, but it was often late. A commander does not need to understand every sapper's action to feel its effect. He feels it when his counterattack cannot move because mines have closed the route. He feels it when the Soviet advance crosses a river before demolition can stop it. He feels it when a bunker still holds from the front but is suddenly threatened from the side. He feels it when the map says a swamp protects the flank and the radio says enemy infantry are already through it. By then, the truth has stopped asking permission. The German army had many skilled engineers of its own, and German commanders were not ignorant men. But they were facing a Soviet system that had learned through defeat, adapted under pressure, and increasingly tied engineering to operational purpose. The Soviet sapper did not merely serve the attack. He helped define where the attack could exist. Assault engineer sapper brigades, formed in 1943, were eventually used in breaking fortified lines and storming cities. Over the war, 20 such brigades were formed, and they became especially associated with close assault against prepared positions and urban strongpoints. In cities, their role became even more visible. A street is a kind of trench. A building is a bunker. A cellar is a tunnel. A staircase is a killing zone. A wall can be safer than a doorway if someone can blow a hole through it. Urban combat rewarded the sapper's eye. The obvious route was usually covered. The front door invited death. The street belonged to machine guns. So assault groups moved through walls, basements, courtyards, ruins, and smoke. They carried charges into places artillery could not politely solve. To the defender, this was unnerving. The attack did not always come where the street said it should come. Came through the wall, through the cellar, through the rubble, through the back of a building that had seemed secure an hour earlier. By the time official recognition caught up, many of the men who had earned it were dead, wounded, transferred, anonymous, or simply absorbed into the next operation. War rarely allows specialists to stand still long enough to be understood. This is why the phrase "realize too late" matters. It was not that German commanders never noticed Soviet sappers. They noticed mines. They noticed bridges. They noticed cleared lanes. They noticed assault groups. What they realized too late was that these were not separate details. They were symptoms of a changed front. A front where the Red Army could defend in depth, attack through obstacles, create crossings under fire, and turn terrain from a fixed condition into a contested weapon. Recognition came in pieces. A report here, a captured document there, a delayed order, a failed counterattack, a bridge taken before demolition, a minefield that stopped armor where open ground had promised speed. The sappers did not need every German commander to understand them. They only needed enough time to finish the work before understanding arrived. And by the time it did, the legacy had already moved beyond the battlefield where it began. The battlefield as a system. The legacy of Soviet sappers in the Second World War was not only that they cleared mines or built bridges. Many armies did that. Their deeper legacy was the lesson that ground is not passive. Ground can be prepared, denied, opened, disguised, repaired, flooded, bridged, mined, unmined, cut apart and stitched back together. The battlefield is not simply where war happens. It is something war makes, and sappers are among the men who make it. By the late war, the Soviet approach to operations increasingly depended on turning tactical ruptures into operational movement. A breach meant little if it could not be widened. A crossing meant little if ammunition could not follow. A captured road meant little if engineers could not keep it usable. A tank breakthrough meant little if mines, craters, rivers, and wrecks stopped the second echelon. This was the lesson hidden beneath the drama. Breakthrough is logistics with blood on it. It is engineering under fire. It is timing. It is the difference between an attack that dents a line and an attack that unhinges a front. German commanders had often been trained to think in terms of battle, position, fire, maneuver, counterattack. The best of them understood far more than that, of course. But the pressures of the Eastern Front, the interference from above, shortages of reserves, and the vastness of the theater made rapid recovery harder each year. Soviet sappers helped widen that gap between German recognition and German reaction. They made it harder for German units to move when movement was needed. They made it easier for Soviet units to move when opportunity appeared. That is a profound change. A minefield at Kursk and a bridge in Belorussia may seem like opposites. One stops movement. One enables it. But to the sapper, they belong to the same logic. Control the passage of men and machines. Who moves? Who stops? Who waits under fire? Who crosses before daylight? Who arrives too late? These questions decide battles as surely as tanks and guns. The Second World War is often remembered through machines because machines are visible. Tigers, T-34s, Katyushas, Stukas, IL-2s, artillery pieces, trucks, half-tracks. The camera understands steel. But machines require paths. The most powerful tank in the world is helpless if it cannot cross the next river, find the next road, avoid the next mine, or pass the wreck burning in front of it. The sapper's work lived in that unglamorous space between power and use. He did not make the tank powerful. He made it present. He did not make infantry brave. He gave them a lane where bravery had a chance to matter. He did not make artillery accurate. He helped build the roads and crossings that brought guns forward. This is why the story still matters. Not because Soviet sappers were flawless. They were not. Not because they alone won the Eastern Front. They did not. But because they show something war often hides. The decisive work is not always the most visible work. Sometimes the front changes because someone solves a small physical problem under conditions no workshop, academy, or map table can reproduce. A wire must be cut. A mine must be lifted. A bridge must hold. A wall must open. A road must survive the rain. A crossing must exist before the enemy understands why that stretch of river mattered. German commanders believed the front was something to be held. What really happened was that the Soviets learned to treat the front as something that could be shaped. And that brings the story back to the man in the grass. The one at 342. The one who did not know how the operation would be remembered. The one whose hand was still on the wire. The hand in the mud. Return to the field east of Vitebsk. The morning is still dark. The sapper is still there, low in the grass, close enough to the German line that a cough might feel dangerous. Behind him, an army waits in layers. Riflemen, gunners, tank crews, medics, drivers, officers with watches. Men who have been told the hour and men who know only that something is about to begin. Ahead of him, the German position waits too. Not evil in the abstract. Not faceless. Men in dugouts, in trenches, beside guns, under orders, inside their own fear. Some are veterans. Some are too young. Some know the Soviet guns will open soon. Some hope the attack will fall somewhere else. Some may already feel that the war is closing around them, but feeling it does not release them from the line. Between the two armies is wire, mud, mines, darkness. The things that maps simplify. The sapper closes the cutter. A small sound. Almost nothing. But war is full of almost nothing moments. A fuse trimmed shorter. A bridge plank shifted into place. A mine found before a boot found it. A lane marked before smoke swallowed the field. A charge placed against a wall. A rope held in a freezing river. A man moving first so others can move after him. The German commanders believed the front was decided by formations, firepower, reserves, and orders. They were not wrong to value those things. Armies need them. Battles cannot be won by wire cutters alone. But what they did not see soon enough was that Soviet sappers had changed the terms under which those things could matter. A reserve that cannot move is only a symbol. A strong point that can be bypassed is already weaker than it looks. A river that can be crossed before dawn is no longer a boundary. A minefield that can be opened becomes a doorway. A field seeded with mines becomes a clock that steals minutes from the attacker. The front was not only held. It was made, unmade, remade. And the men doing that work rarely stood at the center of photographs. They were too low to the ground, too close to smoke, too busy surviving the next few meters. Their tools were not always impressive. Their tasks were not always honored in language large enough to fit the risk. But the Eastern Front, in its final years, increasingly turned on precisely these acts of physical truth. Where can men pass? Where must they stop? What can be crossed? What can be denied? What does the map fail to show? At the beginning of the war, German commanders had believed Soviet strength could be broken by speed, shock, and superior operational skill. Later, they believed prepared defenses could force the Red Army to spend itself against wire, mines, rivers, and strongpoints. But what really happened was more uncomfortable. The Soviets learned. Not cleanly, not gently, not without terrible waste. But they learned. They learned that a front is not a painted line. It is a living system of movement and obstruction. They learned that the same ground can kill an attacker 1 month and carry him forward the next. They learned that engineering was not an afterthought to battle. It was one of battle's hidden languages. The sapper in the grass did not need to know all this. He only needed to finish the cut. And when the wire gave, the opening was still small. Too small for a tank. Too small for history, if history only looks for large things. But the infantry could pass. Then more men. Then guns. Then the front began to move. They believed the front would be decided by tanks, guns, and commands from headquarters. But what really happened was quieter. Before the tanks moved, before the infantry rose, before the German map began to fail, a sapper had to put his hand into the mud and make the battlefield open. The front did not simply break. It was opened. If you are watching from a place touched by this history, write your country or city in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the war, in any uniform, on any front, in any role remembered or forgotten, you are welcome to share their story there as well. Warfront Archive exists to look beyond the famous machines and familiar battles, toward the men whose work changed the war without always entering the headlines. Subscribe to continue hearing the forgotten stories of World War II, what they believed and what really happened.